Sorry, I had to get some things set up there. So the passage that Jeff read for us a few moments ago, I find myself coming back to this quite often because you see Jesus here doing something that you wouldn't expect. There's people wanting to listen to him and to do all of these miracles, and yet he's off by himself, and Peter finds him and says, "What are you doing? Everyone's looking for you, and you need to come." And so we find there in Mark chapter 1 that Jesus is balancing people and priorities and prayer and purpose and all of these kinds of things that we balance in our lives. But he is absolutely clear what it is that he needs to do. And in fact, shockingly in this passage, instead of saying, "Oh, you're right, Peter, what am I thinking? And we need to go so that I can attend to all these people and, spread my name and things of that sort," he says, "We're actually going to go somewhere else." And that always struck me. So Jesus is this example of priorities and ordering life the way that it's supposed to be, and I am not that person. So I have historically been very bad at prioritizing and managing my time, and that's something that I'm trying to get better at. And I imagine that I'm not the only one. We're in this mess of modern life with all of these different things commanding our attention. It feels as though our priority lists are as tall as our house. And we have all of these things every moment of the day that we need to be doing. I recently read an extremely helpful article, very short and to the point, where the author was trying to demonstrate, as you flow throughout the book of Matthew, how Jesus prioritized and divided his time. And I found that extremely helpful, so I want to present tonight some of those observations to help us see how Jesus gives us an example for more purposeful living in a manageable life. To see this as an example. And we're going to expand this a little bit beyond Matthew, but we're going to stay primarily in Matthew. So open your Bibles to Matthew, and we're going to go through that book and see how Jesus structures and orders his life, manages his priorities, and so forth. So some of these ideas don't originate with me, as I said, but I found them helpful, and I've expanded them a little bit in my own study, and I want to share them with you because I think that they can be helpful for all of us. But as we said a moment ago, Jesus understood what was most important. There's no question about that. There's no question that Jesus had a mission and that he stuck to it and he knew what he was supposed to be doing, and every moment of his life had a purpose. So in our lives today, we often don't have a purpose for what we're doing. And we lack clarity as to what is my life about? What am I supposed to be doing? What does my job mean? Why am I doing all of these different things? And so clarity, as we can see in the life of Jesus, is a great gift of God that we have as his children. So when we look at how Jesus lived, we can observe what's most important and see practical examples of how to live that out. So that's what I want to look at in the book of Matthew today. So as we said, Jesus knew his purpose and he lived it. He was on a mission. But how many of us have actually considered that his life in that way is an example for us of how to structure our purpose and to understand why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing? So I want to consider some passages about how Jesus operated in this way. So look first at Matthew chapter 4. So Matthew chapter 4, and as I said, I want you to follow along with me in Matthew, and most of the passages tonight are not going to be on the screen. But in Matthew chapter 4, and starting in verse 23, there's this sort of summary section as to what it is that Jesus is doing. Right after he's called his first disciples, it says, Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. And the news spread about him throughout all Syria. And they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. And large crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond the Jordan. So Jesus is busy and getting down to work. And he's proclaiming in the synagogues, he's teaching people about God's message, he's healing people left and right of all kinds of things. And if you understand the geography of that last verse there, the point is that people from all over the region are coming to see Jesus. And so Matthew is talking to us here about Jesus fulfilling his purpose. And turn really quickly to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, because he essentially tells us the same exact thing. And this is part of how you know that Matthew is painting for us the picture of Jesus fulfilling his purpose and how he lived his life. So if you jump down to Matthew chapter 9 in verse 35, notice the similarity of what he says here. Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. And then it talks about how he's relating to the people. But if you compare those two in Matthew 4 and in Matthew 9, the verbs are the exact same. That Jesus is teaching, proclaiming, and healing. So this is not an accident. This is Jesus structuring his time and fulfilling his purpose in what he's doing. That his purpose in this way was to come and to proclaim the message, to teach it, and to heal people. So Matthew uses this language multiple times throughout the book to highlight that Jesus was extremely purposeful in what he did. He would do intentional things. And in fact, as we saw in Mark chapter 1, sometimes he would ignore other opportunities because he thought that there was something more important that he needed to be doing. And if you notice at what was read in Mark chapter 1, in verse 38, he says, I must preach the good news of the kingdom to the other towns because that is why I came. He knew what his life was about. So in looking at this, we can see first that Jesus prioritized purpose. And that seems pretty obvious. But how many of us really, truly understand our purpose in life and how that influences the way that we do our jobs and how we spend time with our friends and how we lead our families, how we enjoy our leisure time? How many of us have this understanding that Jesus did about this? So let's look at some other examples. So Matthew chapter 26. Let's look at this one. And this is, again, Matthew telling us something and showing that Jesus was doing things very purposefully in what he did. So this is right when Jesus is being betrayed and arrested in the garden. And the crowds come up to him. And in verse 55, so Matthew 26:55, it says, At that time Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? And pay attention to this phrase for us. Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. Jesus says, I was teaching every day because that was his purpose. He came to teach, to tell people about God and his plan of redemption. And this is what Jesus was here for. I want to share one more, and this one will be on the screen because it's out of the book of Matthew. But the language that Mark uses here is extremely interesting. And so it's Mark chapter 10 and verse 1, since you can't see because of the subtitles. And so Mark chapter 10 and verse 1 reads, And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. So Mark is pointing out to us that this is Jesus' habit. His habit was to teach people. This is what he did. In Matthew 26, Jesus says, I was in the temple teaching you every single day. And why would someone do something every single day if it wasn't their purpose? So the other part of Jesus' purpose, and this is part of what we understand, and I know you know Jesus' purpose was to teach, and I know you know that Jesus' purpose was to carry out God's plan. But let's think about this and what we can learn from how Jesus lives this. So in Matthew chapter 20, let's look at this. Matthew chapter 20, and Jesus talking about his purpose not only to teach and to heal, but to carry out God's redemptive plan. So Matthew chapter 20 and in verse 28. And so this is in the middle of a thought. He's teaching his disciples, and they're saying, will you give us glory when you're with you? And he says, you don't know what you're asking about, and you all need to realize that you need to serve each other. In verse 28, he says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So the counterpart to that is Mark chapter 10 and verse, it's either 45 or 49. It's 45. It's in my notes. I always get that mixed up. Where Jesus says, this is why I came, not for other people to serve me, but I came to serve other people by giving my life as a ransom. So Jesus understood my purpose is not just to teach people. My purpose is also to serve them by giving my life as a ransom. And we can't really talk about this type of subject without going to Matthew chapter 26 again and looking at Jesus' prayers in the garden. So we'll look at this and then one more example that will be on the screen. So Matthew chapter 26, the darkest night of Jesus' life, I would imagine without a question. And you really see here what's important. So he's in the garden and he's praying. And in verse 39, so Matthew 26, 39, it says, he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And it says he prayed this multiple times throughout the night for hours. And so Jesus reveals here, regardless of what he wanted, he did not want to go through this to some extent. He says, not what I want, what you want, Father. So Jesus' purpose, according to his prayer here, was to please God, to do his will, not his own. And so this is related to something I want to share here from John chapter 12. So this is John 12, 27 through 28. And so again, he's talking about what's going to happen when he's raised up, when he does all of these things, why he came. And in verse 27, he says, now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour. So Father, glorify your name. And then the Father responds. So Jesus says, I'm upset and I'm uncomfortable and I don't like what's about to happen. He's talking about being raised and lifted up in his crucifixion. And he says, what am I going to say? Father, save me from this. This is why I came. So, Father, you glorify yourself. My purpose is to glorify you, to do your will. And so Jesus structured his life around what was most important in light of his purpose. So his purpose was to teach and to heal. It was also to glorify God and to carry out his will. And he let his mission and his purpose direct what he did. His day-to-day rhythms and his activities and the way that he structured his time was all around this purpose of his. And so that lesson of Jesus helps us to align our lives with our purpose in order to prioritize our time and activities. And you're thinking, I don't teach in the synagogues every day, and I definitely am not giving my life as a ransom for many, so what does this have to do with me? The follow-up question is, okay, I understand. Jesus structured his life according to his purpose, but what's my purpose? And that's what a lot of us are asking. I think Jesus gives us an overall guide to this. We don't have time to go into all kinds of things about looking at vocation and every little nitty-gritty detail of our lives. But when you look at the things that Jesus was doing and what he said about why he was doing those things, what is a general point that Jesus returns to when he is describing his purpose? And it was part of the last things that we talked about, God's will and God's glory. You want to sum up what Jesus' purpose was? It was God's will and God's glory, and specifically he acted that out in being the ransom, in being the proclamation of his kingdom. But it was God's will and God's glory that was his life's purpose. He directs us and shows us that that's our purpose too. Your purpose, if you want to make it as simple as you possibly can, is to do God's will and to glorify God in your life. And so examples of that, if you think in Matthew, and this would be in Matthew chapter 6, in the Lord's Prayer, he taught us to pray, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. That's what we're supposed to focus on. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's struggling with what he's going to have to endure, what did he say? He said, not what I want, but what you want. So Jesus is laying this example that a purposeful life goes for God's will and God's glory. And there are other records of Jesus saying the same thing, as we saw, for instance, in John chapter 12, that Jesus says, it doesn't really matter what I want. I'm doing what the Father wants. And so Jesus shows us in general that whatever our particular context, no matter what our job is or our talents or what family situation we're in, our purpose is to glorify God and to accomplish His will. So that purpose should drive our efforts. That should be how we structure our time. And so the way I want you to think about it is a tree, maybe. Tree or umbrella, I'm going to go with tree. I thought about it in both ways. So at the top of the tree is, or let's go to the bottom of the tree. Now I'm thinking of that. The bottom of the tree is God's will and God's glory. And when you branch off to say, my job, how does my job fit into God's glory? And you have another branch of how I relate to my family go for God's will and God's glory. And you can splinter off to that. So considering family, how do I spend time with my kids in light of how I am glorifying God in my family? How do I manage my family's finances? I mean, you see that it splinters off into all these particular aspects, all tracing back to the trunk of accomplishing God's will for His glory. And so again, I can't tell you in your particular circumstance, when you're sitting in your cubicle or you're talking to whoever at work, how in that moment you can fulfill your purpose, but that is the framework to think through it through. So the first step, and that word to look to for how we do our work and how we relate to our family and how we spend time with our friendships, all traces back to this idea of purpose that Jesus is talking about. But do you ever feel like what you're supposed to be doing to fulfill your purpose is in conflict with the people around you? That people just won't let you do what you need to do or accomplish your tasks. For example, if I don't think about it correctly, I can fall into thinking that sitting down with people or having to shift things around because a need comes up is in conflict with the study that I have to do in order to fulfill my purpose to teach. So that's not the right way to think about it, is it? Or maybe you think about it, I'm trying to finish this work project and my kids keep interrupting me. Whatever example you want to put in, to where we feel as though fulfilling our purpose and people conflict with each other. However, think for a minute. If we think about that tree again, it's for the people that we do our work. I do my work to glorify God, to support my family. So whether that's teaching or providing for our families or providing a service for people or selling a product, that work is for people. And so that's the philosophical way to look at it. But think about what Jesus did. Jesus was teaching people, and He was healing people, and He was declaring God's kingdom for His glory and for reconciliation to people. And you can see in how He interacted with them that people and purpose were not in conflict, but they're actually two sides to the same coin. That they are a balance, not in opposition. And so Jesus was there for people. One person I saw put it as, Jesus had a purpose, but He was also available. So let's look at Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, in this idea that Jesus prioritized people. So at the opening of the chapter, Jesus is encountering a leper here in this context. And it says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed Him. Tons of people everywhere. And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest, and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So if you read between the lines and trace this out, there was large crowds following Jesus, and then all of a sudden, in verse 4, he's having a private conversation with this leper that no one else is supposed to know about. So what happened to everyone else? So Jesus saw this opportunity where he was with these people coming down from the mountain, and he took a step aside to focus on this individual man. You don't see anywhere that someone falls in front of Jesus and asks for help and mercy, and he says, "Get away from me. Don't you know I'm busy?" He takes the time to be there for people. And so we see this in this leper. Turn to chapter 9. So in chapter 9, this is the story of the paralytic. And we'll start in verse 2. "And they brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. And seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, 'Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven.' And some of the scribes said to themselves, 'This fellow blasphemes.'" And so we go on to this discussion about blaspheming, which is easier to say get up or to say your sins are forgiven. And it says in verse 7, "And he got up and went home, but when the crowd saw this, they were awestruck and glorified God who had given such authority to men." So this is a story that we're familiar with. But in Mark's account, so in Mark chapter 2 in the opening there, it's revealed that at this time, there were so many people gathered together that Mark says there was no room, not even near the door. Nobody could get in to speak to him. That's how many people were here. And yet again, one person comes who needs his help, and he says, "Hold on a second, we're going to take a time out, and I'm going to deal with this." You don't see that as much with Matthew, but it's the same thing, that Jesus is here with these crowds, and he's teaching them, and that's what Mark makes plain, that he's teaching there in the house when they come to him and realize that he's back in Capernaum. And this one person is here. And again, it's not, "Do you see that everybody's here to listen to me? Can you come back another time, make an appointment with Peter, and I'll catch you later?" No, we don't see that. Jesus took the time from teaching this large crowd to focus on this one man. He did it with the leper, he did it here. And we won't read it, but look a little further in chapter 9. Starting at about verse 18, the story that some of us will know about the ruler of the synagogue coming and saying, "Sir, my daughter is dying and I need you to come and heal her." And so it says Jesus starts on his way. And he's on his way to heal this daughter that's dying. And then this one lady comes along and has the gall to pull on Jesus' clothes and stop him, right? No, that's not what he says. So in verse 20 there, he's on his way to do this healing. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up from behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, for she was saying to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will get well." But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." Again, he is literally going somewhere for a purpose. And this woman comes up, and she could have touched Jesus, and he could have understood that something happened and kept going. But he doesn't. He takes the time to pause and to make her a priority. Because she is not in conflict with his purpose, she's part of it. And so on his way to heal the synagogue leader's daughter, which would have been a pretty big deal, you mess that up and you're not going to be well liked in the Jewish community, right? But he takes the time to heal this woman, and not only that, but he talks with her and assures her of her state. Let's go to one more example of Matthew 19. So Matthew 19, another famous example that gives us a lot of clarity into how Jesus thinks about things and thinks about people. So Matthew 19, and let's look at verse 13. It says, "Then some children were brought to him so that he might lay hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked him. But Jesus said, 'Let the children alone, and do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these.' After laying his hands on them, he departed from there." And so the teacher is busy teaching and fulfilling his purpose and proclaiming the gospel of God's kingdom. And these parents have the nerve to send their children up to Jesus and to ask for a blessing. That's what the disciples are thinking, right? Can you not see that he's busy here? Get your kids away. But Jesus, once again, he rebukes them and he says, "Let them come to me." This is not in conflict with what we're doing. In fact, these are who the kingdom belongs to. And so he brings them in and he embraces them and he blesses them. So you see from this, the disciples thought that Jesus had more important things to do than interact with children. But he didn't see it that way at all. He embraces them and blesses them. And so to Jesus, looking at those examples, people were part of the mission, part of his purpose. It was a balance. It's not a fight between the two. And we have to achieve that also. In understanding our purpose and how to carry that out, we cannot see people in conflict with that. Sometimes we have to shift things around, and it gets difficult. There's times when something comes up, and I don't get to wrap up a sermon on the day that I feel like I want to wrap it up on, and you know what? I have to push it because people matter. So we shouldn't see work and people in conflict, but as two complementary things that need to be done. Sometimes our work and our activities are obviously more connected with people than others, but Jesus shows us that we should always try to make time for people, to make them a priority. Because as we said, when we step back and look at it, that's why we're doing all of this. And is it any coincidence that Jesus tells us the two greatest commands for our lives are, one, to love God with all our being, which I think goes back to that idea of prioritizing purpose, and then two, to love our neighbor as we would love ourselves, to prioritize people. That's not a coincidence. So combining those first and second priorities, life is about loving and serving God and other people. And so we have to figure out how do our vocation and the way that we spend our weekends, or how do we interact with our family, how does all of that fit in? And I thought the author of that original article that I talked about made a really good point, where he says, "I'm too busy to love" is not the slam dunk excuse that we think it is. I'd never heard it put that way. I'm too busy to love you, to help you, to serve you, because I'm focused on something else. That's not the excuse that we think it is. And a big part of why Jesus was able to stay focused on his priorities and to see people as important as they are was because of his habits around prayer. And we've talked about this. This is not something that I don't think I need to prove this to you. Jesus was constantly praying. He had prayer habits, he had rhythms. It was central to his life. And so you look at things, sometimes Jesus would get up in the morning to pray. Sometimes he would pray at night. We have instances, for example, Luke 6 and verse 12, Jesus prayed through the entire night. He often instructed people to pray. Prayer was Jesus, you could say. That is what he did. So prayer was such a big part of Jesus' life that people took notice. And it led others to ask Jesus to teach them how to pray. And so that is what we see in Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, in Luke 11, in the first 4 verses, where they say, "Jesus, we see you praying. Can you teach us how to pray also?" So Jesus made prayer a priority. It was how he communed with the Father. It was how he gained clarity before big decisions. That's an interesting thing. If you look at the moments in the Gospels where it's mentioned that Jesus is spending the whole night in prayer, it's right before something big happens. Choosing the disciples, giving his life as a ransom, sending people out. Jesus spent times like that in prayer. And so no matter how busy or what was going on, Jesus prayed. How many of us can say the same thing? I saw a lot of heads do this. So for me, sometimes, especially in the morning, if I don't feel like I'm on schedule, I'm not hitting my time marks like I want to, I so easily push off prayer. I'm too busy. I'm doing all these things. I got to make sure to get that done first. I'll get to it later. And surprise, I don't get to it later. I think keeping this priority of prayer is one of the major things that fed and supported Jesus' other two priorities that we've looked at. That this is how, in a lot of ways, he was able to accomplish this through God's power. To keep clear on what his purpose was, to be able to help people in the way that he did, because he was in constant communion with God the Father. So how can we expect to live and structure our lives according to what God wants if we don't communicate with him and allow him to shape our hearts and minds? It doesn't make sense, does it? And so often I think, well, I'm going to do this thing presumably for God, for the church, but I'm too busy to talk to God about it. I'm just going to get it done myself. And that's backward. That same author from earlier remarked, this guy is very good at these little one-liners I'm finding. He says, skipping prayer to save time is like being on a road trip and saying you don't have time to stop for gas. And I think he's right. Skipping prayer to save time is like being on a road trip and saying, I don't have time to stop for gas. And then we're shocked when the car comes rolling to a screeching halt. Jesus understood that. And that is what fueled his life. And you see, no matter how busy things were, no matter what Peter thought he should be doing and going and talking to the crowds, no matter what was going on, he was praying. Because that is what drove everything else. That's what gave him clarity and direction in his purpose. And so we see this. Jesus prioritized purpose and people and prayer. This is how Jesus structured his life and how he directed how he would use his time. And these things all supported and fed into each other. And we would do well to follow Jesus' example. Not just as the example of human flourishing. This is not a selfish thing. But because it will lead us to more fruitful and purposeful lives in serving and glorifying God and fulfilling our purpose. And that is in a time when so many of us are confused as to what it is that we're supposed to be doing in any given moment, in any stretch of our lives. We wonder, what am I doing and why am I doing it? And Jesus can help us to see that. So we can focus on what God wants us to do. And we can make time for people, and we can stay connected to God as our source of power and guidance as we glorify him and accomplish his will. And so the questions for us to walk away is, how does how I use my time reveal what I'm prioritizing? If I'm going throughout my week, and I'm thinking of this because of my PowerPoint background, if I'm going throughout my week and I compare how often I'm watching sporting events to how often I'm spending time with God's people, and the balance is more in favor of the ball games, where's the priority? Those are the examples that we need to think about. And how can I structure my life more closely around the example of Jesus? He shows us what's important in the way that we need to direct ourselves. And so the world is going to try to tell you all kinds of things that you need to prioritize and structure your life around. But the reality is that none of them can compete with the purpose that you have and that you were created for as one of God's people. He can give your life an eternal, fulfilling meaning. He can clean you and bring you into his family and help you to live your life for him, to fulfill purpose, to have the purpose that you were created to fulfill, and to be joyful in doing it. And if that appeals to you, if we can help you in some way to realize your purpose for living and for being here, then please let us know. Talk to someone. Be thinking about it as we stand and sing.